this is a clip from my upcoming interview with Waterstones about the book, The Trading Game. That's coming out March the 5th. If you pre-order from Waterstones using the code in the description, then you can get 20% off. So that will be valid for all pre-orders, so up to March 4th. I hope you enjoy the interview.
You describe very well the sort of unhappiness actually that comes from being given that kind of wealth, living the kind of life you were living, going to different parts of the world as part of your job, but really none of that actually making you happy or filling the void.
You know, it's a funny one. This didn't get into the book actually, but I remember having, suddenly it's come back to me, one conversation I had with the girl who I was dating at the time, and I got this first big bonus. And it's one of the first few moments when I sort of actually thought about, why does this money not make me happy? And I think when I don't want to glamorize poverty at all, but when you're young and you come from where you've got nothing, everything's like a positive bet because you've got nothing to lose. And then suddenly you get given this money and it's like, I've never had anything. You know, when I was a kid, I lived in a tiny little bedroom with my brother in a bunk bed, and everything I owned was in a random shelf, not like a shelf from like a chest of drawers that had been taken out of just under the bed. Everything I owned was in that drawer. And then suddenly someone gives you £500,000. You know, like I didn't have my own, I'd never owned anything. When I was scared of shops. I didn't know how shops worked. I'd never been in the shop. Yeah, so, and then suddenly you get £500,000. And you know what do you do? You know, and then there's this scene in the book where they say, oh, buy something for your dad. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, you know, because like, I've never bought anything for anyone. They're like, what does your dad like? I'm like, oh, he likes football. You buy him Sky Sports then. I buy him Sky Sports. But what they didn't know was, before I was working at the bank, I used to go with my dad to Leyton Orient every week. You know, it was £23 a year for a season ticket for kids. And we used to sit next to each other and watch the game with Harry Samby, who's also a character in the book. But when I was working at the bank, I didn't have time for that anymore. I was so busy. So then they think that this money is like a path for me to bring happiness to my family. They don't realise that actually it's taking me away from my family. And then I would wake up on Saturdays and I'd see my dad watching the midday kickoff on Sky Sports, and it would make me so unhappy. And it was just this, but it's another one of those things that you just kind of, you compartmentalise and you hide away the things that you're losing and you focus on the things that you're winning. But you know, I think the book, it captures it very well, this sort of descent into unhappiness and also perhaps sort of madness that came. So what do you do? I think there's this, but it's not just me, even though I come from a poor background. I think there's this, that trading floor is a room full of people who, to some degree, have traded their happiness for money and are trying to trade it back. And that's why you see them, they go and they buy, you know, amazing new bike and they never ride it. They buy a whole new set of skis. They're trying to buy back the happiness and the youth that they've traded away. And it's a big thing I wanted to get across in the book is the sadness of these space. You know, that is a room full of very unhappy men and very wealthy unhappy men. And what does that mean that we've constructed our society in that way?
There are some, as I said earlier, fascinating characters in the book that you worked with. And I wonder if we could talk about a couple of them. The first of them is the man who sort of frames the book, because he's there at the beginning and he's there right at the end as well, which is Caleb. Could you tell us a little bit about Caleb and why he's such an incredible character? Yes,
I mean, Caleb was the guy who ran the trading game competition. And very smooth, charming, charismatic man. He was the youngest ever managing director at Citibank, which is like a really big deal. And he sort of comes in, he's this massive guy, larger than life. And he recognised very quickly, Gary's like really, really smart. Let's get this guy in. And of course, you know, I'm just like a little kid basically. And I see this guy like he's a super rich trader, like he's the guy. I want to be like this guy. And then he hires me, he brings me in. And then very suddenly he leaves. And he leaves. And it's like, because he's in a sense, he's like lived the dream. And another big theme of the book is, do you leave? Can you leave? Do people leave? And this guy does it. And then that sort of, but you know, as it develops, it turns out that this departure was not as simple as it seems. And perhaps he had appeared to be able to leave, but he wasn't able to leave. And this sort of, you know, I don't want to give too much away, but it raises questions essentially about appearances. This guy appeared so seductive and so complete, and yet he was unable to leave, despite being super rich. And this mirrors, of course, my own journey, which my own beginning of questioning, should you leave? And of course, that raises bigger questions about, really, I think, the effects of money and the effects of greed and the effects of power on the individual. And you know, I think we all face these questions on some level. You know, we all pursue money and have questions about, you know, should I work harder? Should I spend more time with my family? But he was my first ever boss, and he was also my final boss. He was not my boss the whole time. And our relationship went on a journey, let's say. I don't want to give too much away, but the readers can experience what I experienced.
Yeah, because there is something almost mafia-like in the sort of the threat of you not basically being able to, as you say, are you going to get paid?
Yeah,
is what the question you keep asking in the book. Because if you try to leave the job, your bonus, for those who don't understand, is not simply a big check that you get and that's it. It's paid incrementally over a period of time. Yeah. So that means if you say, I'm leaving the job, goodbye bonus.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you actually get the money that you're supposed to get?
Yeah. I wanted to sort of, one thing I really wanted to do with this book, I think, like, I was quite lucky, like, from a literary perspective. You've got a nice opportunity here, because I grew up in East London, not far from these skyscrapers. And then I work in this space. And these two spaces physically are not that far apart from one another, but they're completely different worlds, right? So you want to play with, like, the contrast. Me going in, you know, we talk about waking up, like, and having a shower with this little hand hose from Argos that you plug into the taps, and then, like, going into these massive skyscrapers, and then working with these millionaires, and then going home to your, like, crowded house and this kind of thing. But you know, the opening scene of the book so is basically me being threatened by this character Caleb, and it's very mafia-esque, you know. And you know, when I was a kid, I come from a very poor background. I grew up in a pretty rough area. I was expelled from school for selling drugs. You know, I wouldn't say I was a drug dealer or ever a criminal, but you know, these elements existed around me in the street I grew up. You know, there were drug dealers and there were criminals. Like, I grew up with these people, and you know, I did the right thing. I studied hard. I got a good job, and you kind of think that you're going that way. You're choosing another path, and then I quickly became very senior at Citibank, and then you suddenly see, like, well, when you're doing what they want you to do, everything's fine. As soon as you start varying, suddenly these guys are acting just like the same way the drug dealers on the street act.
Right.
And what I wanted to do was, you know, collapse that physical space and say, listen, these people may look very different, and they may run your life, and they may have all the power. But once you dig a bit beneath the surface, you know, are they any better than us? Are they any, you know? And, you know, my experience of those two spaces was, you know, they're basically the same, you know, and I think that is an empowering message, you know, to people from both sides of the coin, which is like, you know, if you come from a poor background, don't think these people are better than you, because they're not. And if you come from a rich background, don't think you're better than those people, because that can get you in trouble, you know. And I think that's very, very relevant in this society we live in, increasing inequality, you know, and people who know the work I do outside of this book will know this is something I'm very passionate about. I think it's a massive problem.
One of the fascinating characters in the book is Billy, who's quite an enigma, but tell me a little bit about him and why he was so important.
So Billy was the only trader on my desk who didn't go to university. And when I started working there in 2008, he was already in his mid to late 40s. He's from Liverpool. He's a Scouser. He had a strong Scouse accent, and he, from a very working class background, he started working as a teenager on the cash desk at Halifax. And he's managed to work his way up over the course of like 30 years to being a senior trader at Citibank. And when I turn up, he's had a rough couple of years. He's not done very well. And he basically hates everyone on the trading floor. He thinks that they're really posh, and people are like, who's this guy? Who's this dickhead base? He's not making any money. Yeah. But I obviously, because I see like he's from sort of similar background to me, and I kind of, I think like this is a guy I want to make friends with. There's one scene really early in the book when some guys on another desk keep playing music, and he keeps saying, "Can you turn the music down?" And they keep turning it back. Can you turn the music down? And eventually, he just pulls the speakers of the wires of the speaker through the desk and just snips them. And I was like, and then the guys come, what's going on? And then I was like, this is the guy I want to hang out with. But suddenly in 2008 crisis, this guy just makes an absolute unbelievable fortune. And it turns out he's been sitting there just betting that the world's going to blow up for years. And we formed a very close bond, and he sort of takes me under his wing. And he kind of becomes, I guess, a bit of a spiritual guru to me in a way, and also a trading guide because he's a very, very good trader. And after I have my first big loss, which is into my second year as a trader, I instinctively went back to the textbooks. I started bringing my textbooks into the office. And I'm sitting next to Billy by this point. I'm like Billy's junior. And I'm reading the textbooks every day. After like second or third day, Billy just can't take it anymore. Just slaps the textbooks out of my hand, straight into the bin. And he's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you're not a kid anymore. You're not going to find out the key to the world in those textbooks. If you want to know what's happening in the world, if you want to know what's happening in the economy, go home and ask your mum what's happening in her economy. Ask your friends' mums. Walk down the high street and look at what's happening. The shops are closing down. Look at the homeless people. Is there more or less of them? Look at what's being advertised on the tube. And he basically says to me, if you want to understand the economy, time comes, you have to go out and look at the fucking economy, basically. You can't just read about it in books. And that was, a big moment for me where it sort of, and in a sense, is sort of the catalyst for everything that's happened since, which is my willingness to sort of step out of the theory and into the world. And that's sort of what propels me into becoming the very successful trader I became.
Yeah, because you had a good sense, as you say, of what was actually happening. So that after that crash that you mentioned where Billy makes a lot of money, everyone's expecting for things to return to normal.
Yeah.
But your sense told you it's not going to return to normal. It's broken. Its interest rates are going to stay low. Everything's going to stay down here. And that was how you made your millions, as a trader, because you kept betting against what everybody else was expecting. We were talking about the sort of the moral dubiousness of something like Wolf of Wall Street. Obviously, looking back now, making huge amounts of money when you're doing it on a sort of about wealth inequality, as you say, that's what you could see. How did it feel writing about that? And sort of now, obviously, you're an activist in terms of economics, but how does it sort of square with you, sort of having made that money basically off the back of a broken economy?
Yeah, there's this one scene in the book which I think is quite good, so myself, which is where I kind of have this penny drop moment where I finally realise this is it. This is what's going to happen, which is, I start to realise, like, it's 2011, which is the year of the sovereign debt crisis. So, like, all of the big governments in Europe basically collapse financially. And I start to see, before this has happened, like, these governments are going to go bankrupt. And I start to see the similarity between them and my friends' families that are losing their houses, going into debt. And I start thinking, okay, well, all the ordinary people are losing their assets, going into debt. Governments losing their assets are going into debt. Where's it going? And then I'm surrounded by these millionaires. So, okay, what we have here is, there's a shift of power, there's a shift of ownership, there's a shift of wealth. It's being drained out of the middle class, out of governments, into the rich. Well, what are the rich going to do with that? They're going to buy more assets, which means it's going to accelerate, which means that the middle class will become completely impoverished. There'll be an explosion in poverty in this country. Governments will be bankrupted. It's going to, it's going to cause basic collapse of Western society. And then there's this penny drop where it's like, I know what I've got to do. I've got to buy green Eurodollars. You look at it back and you're like, here is a very talented young kid. He's obviously smart. He's figured out a really important thing. And his instinct is monetize. And that is the person that I was trained to, that was my job, you know what I mean? So it's sort of, I think it's, when I look back, I don't think about it morally. I'm a mathematician in my heart. I think, listen, this is the society we've built. There are people whose job it is to manage our economy, and they get paid 50 grand a year. And there's people whose job it is to bet on our economy, and they get paid £2 million a year. Right? If that is how you construct your economy, what do you think is going to happen? And I've walked away now from that money, and now I sort of try to prevent, our economy collapsing. Not doing the best job of it so far, but I'm still going for it. I'm not out here trying to be Mahatma Gandhi. I'm not a moral philosopher. What I wanted to do with this book, I didn't want to make any like moral judgments. It's a bit like, have you read Candide by Voltaire? Mm-hmm. I think the most powerful way to show people how broken our system is not for me to tell them it's broken. It's for me to take them with me, take them to the places I've been, take them to the top of the mountain and show them the tsunami that's coming. Mm-hmm. And people can make their own judgments about whether it's right, whether it's wrong, People who are interested can go and look at the work that I do now. They can look at my YouTube channel, and I think it's pretty clear where I stand on it. But, I was a young kid. My job was to bet on the economy. And that's what I did. And it's, you know, it's not just me. You know, the best paid 10,000 economists in the world, all traders. All traders. They don't work for your governments. So that's the way the world is, I'm afraid. I didn't make it that way.